no intention of doing that in the first place. So I'm going to share my screen because I often do this with a slideshow. Now watch. Let's see if this is going to work.
And while she's doing that, I'll just tell you that I'm going to mute everybody, but you can write questions. You know where the chat is and all that.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I just have to.
Yeah. So for me, a couple things about this. So this is a long ago medical story about how somebody completely unorthodox became an innovator. But lately, I've also been thinking about how much resonance it has now in that the questions about which lives we save with very limited resources are unfortunately as relevant as ever. So advanced technologies don't necessarily make these questions easier in terms of what we do with resources. And when studying history, I always find like it's very tempting to look back at early periods in history and feel more enlightened and superior, but we're grappling with a lot of the same issues just wrapped in a different packaging. So that's a little bit about this story. And then there's also, and in this story itself is a little bit about how I ended up writing this thing. More than is in the book, I was a magazine editor for what I describe as many lifetimes in dog years. I never in a million years expected to do anything like this. And it was kind of like diving off the deep end. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. And I did end up in the book in part because I'll tell you that even after the Jeannie, I just did something bad.
What?
I lost the bottom of my screen.
I can see everything. Oh,
I know, but how do I get you back onto the side so that I can move my slides how I want to? Because I can't get my direction.
Ooh, oh wait, let me unmute people. Maybe there's somebody who knows more about Zoom than I do.
I just, now I see two people on the bottom. I need to get you guys back over to the side because I can't.
Maybe try participants. Click on participants at the bottom. Do you see that, Dawn?
No, oh, here, I can move. Let me just move backwards. I'm just going through. Okay, I'm good now.
Okay. We're good.
All right, okay.
And wait, before you go on, make sure you guys, if you have questions, you can either ask them during her presentation or afterwards. But you write them in the chat function, and I'll find them and I'll unmute you so you can have a discussion with Dawn. Okay.
Jean, I'm losing this again. It's forwarding, and I can't.
You see the little there's a little arrow at the bottom.
No, see that all went away.
Oh, I see an arrow. Okay, I'm going to unmute people.
Oh gosh.
Is it not?
Now I can see one person at a time speaking. Now I see a strip of people speaking at the bottom. And what I'm trying to do is get you over to the side so I can see my button where I can forward the slides. I'm so sorry. I haven't done this on Zoom.
Can you take it off of full screen?
Yeah, you should be able to drag the strip of our heads. You should be able to drag that anywhere you want, depending on which which view you're in.
Okay. So I'm kind of.
Did you take it off of full screen?
I did.
Does that help?
Yes. Well, okay. I actually didn't take it off full screen. I just moved you guys.
Oh, we moved.
Now you keep moving back. Okay. I'm just going to move you over there. Okay. All right. So anyway, I had been a magazine editor forever, and it this went through 4 drafts, and I had some crazy idea that a nonfiction book would be kind of like a magazine article, only a much longer. And all I can say is my first draft that I struggled over, my agent was like, nobody wants to read a 300-page Wikipedia article. It was devastating. And I knew I kind of had to put some life in it. I started realizing the story behind this story was interesting as well, I hope. So it actually started for me with this picture, which I'm hoping you can see. I don't know where your little strip is, but it says living babies in incubators. This is the Chicago World's Fair in 1933 and 34. It's not the famous Chicago World's Fair, which you usually think of the Devil in the White City. That was in the 1890s. But it was after my father died, and I was cleaning out his papers, and he didn't really have much, but he had, and it was an old, like a school assignment, and he wrote about going to this World's Fair in Chicago. And I thought, I didn't even know there was a World's Fair in Chicago during the Depression. My mom grew up in Chicago. Also, they would have both been there. And somehow or other, I became intrigued by this. Honestly, I think it was just a way of trying to understand more about my parents' lives and the world that they lived in before I was born. My mother was gone by then as well. I started just looking at pictures of this World's Fair. I suppose in the back of my mind, I was kind of hoping maybe I'd see a picture of my parents, and then I thought, how would you even recognize one of your parents pinned small as a child in a crowd scene? You wouldn't. But I saw some pretty crazy things. And the craziest thing I saw at this World's Fair was this enormous sign that says living babies in incubators. What the heck is that? This is also the Midway. It's the amusement area. So there was a hall of science and a hall of technology and a hall of medicine. But this is just a Midway exhibit. It was you could pay a quarter and go in, and it was near the midget village and that kind of stuff. So I thought, how crazy is that? And who would allow their child to be exhibited in that way? Were these just orphans or children of the very poor? Is this the most grotesque exploitation and voyeurism? Is it the commodification of human life? Or is it something else? I really did nothing with that. I was working as a magazine editor, but it was kind of marinating. And at the same time, I heard that there was a Coney Island museum that had opened. And I don't know how many of you have been to Coney Island. I love Coney Island. It's insane. I dragged a friend out there with me. The Coney Island Museum is more of a fun house. Coney Island, in its heyday, was known as the People's Playground, and it was really for everybody. So people who lived in sweatshops and in tenements and worked in sweatshops could just get on the new train and go out to the ocean. It was mobbed there, and it was filled with all kinds of amusements. And some of the amusements were quite risque. So the other nickname for Coney Island was Sodom by the Sea. And I was just looking at this, and all of a sudden I see, wait a minute. The same thing is at Coney Island. It's the same incubator exhibit much earlier. And I don't know where your strip is, but on the right side, it says infant incubators with living infants. On the left, it says under the sea. That's an aquarium. So, fish, babies, right? It all comes out of the same slop. Well, this exhibit, turns out, was also in Atlantic City, and before it was a scungy gambling mecca, Atlantic City was America's honeymoon capital, and you could go, and there were elegant hotels, and there was the Heinz Pickle Pier. The term high rollers actually came from there. It wasn't about gambling. It was that you could pay somebody to wheel you along the boardwalk in one of those high chairs. And there was infant incubators there. There were outposts and amusement parks all over the country: Chicago, Minneapolis, Denver, almost every major American World's Fair of the early 20th century, including the Century of Progress. So I thought, this is I don't get it. Why, if there's a life-saving technology, is it a Midway attraction? It's like saying we have a cure for breast cancer, but you have to be in a show. How do we judge something like this? I had to get to the bottom of this story. I assumed there would be a book about it, but there wasn't. And a very cursory search of just Googling around, all of these shows were the work of this one man. He was kind of a mysterious European man who called himself Dr. Martin Arthur Couney. And he was quite famous, especially by the 1930s. And his story, as he told it, was an absolute doozy. So he claimed he was born in Alsace, which would make him kind of French. and that he was educated in Leipzig and Berlin. That would have been the best medical education in the world at that time. And then he became the handpicked protege of this very revered French pediatrician named Pierre Boudin, who was among the people to develop the infant incubator. He then claimed Boudin sent him to Berlin to show off the new incubator, and they were so excited by it that they called it the child hatchery. He had this crazy, crazy story that he went from there to London, to the Queen Victoria Jubilee, and then he came to the United States for the Omaha World's Fair in 1898. So after which somehow he was seized with a desire to relocate across an ocean. Why would you do that? You know, after you've seen Omaha, you can never return to Paris. I think I'll just give up my institutional affiliation with one of the world's leading doctors so I can practice medicine next to the alligator boy in the Shoot the Chutes. I thought there was something Kerflooey with this story, although I had no idea how Kerflooey. It was repeated this way again and again during his lifetime, but also repeated this way in peer-reviewed journals. And anything that mentioned him up to that date, that was the same thing. And every interpretation of him was based on that story. So here I am very blithely going off to my agent. I had done some books before that were fiction. And I actually said to my agent, tell me if this is a dumb idea. You really shouldn't do that. And she said, no, I can sell that. So it was the fastest thing she ever sold. She came back, she said, I have a contract for this. And I thought, oh, great. I have my job and I can just knock this off. I'll Google around, I'll interview some people. Boy, was I in for a surprise. First of all, about a month later, I was laid off from that job. Like many people, I was now in my 50s, earning too much money in an industry that was imploding, and of course managed to lose the job right when you're kind of too old to get another job. But I did have this book contract, and I realized actually I could never, ever have gotten to the bottom of this if I'd had the job. So there was that. It was 4 years down a rabbit hole of archival research because this guy was so tricky and I wasn't really sure where to look. I quickly realized that this was a fake name. It wasn't French or German, if you look at Couney. And I ended up having to, I got help from the New York Public Library, and they kind of said, well, where's his immigration? Where's his naturalization? What's in his probate files? You have to go to Brooklyn and look in those files. You have to go and look at property deeds. You have to go look at all kinds of original documentation that hadn't been cited anywhere. Because if you just read the articles, even in peer-reviewed journals, if they had footnotes, the footnotes always went right back to Couney himself. So the first thing I saw was that his funeral was held in a place called Kirschenbaum's Westminster Abbey, just oi. So I realized, okay, so he was Jewish, and I found out his name was Cohn, and he was born in a town called Krotishin, which made him not kind of French, but kind of Polish. And he arrived here, and this took well over a year to find out because he obscured things so well. He came here in 1888. He was 18 years old, and he came here to steerage class. And it was like, oh my God, I found you. I got it. And it was also this revelation of like, I found this thing and the experts were wrong. What do I do with that? And I kept coming back to that. But meantime, if you arrive in 1888, and it was definitely him, because I later found family members who confirmed that one. So what's the first thing you see in 1888 coming to the New World? When I do this live, everybody says, well, of course, it's the Statue of Liberty. But it actually wasn't. It was Coney Island. And specifically what you'd see is this crazy thing. It was called the Elephant Hotel, which is just what it sounds like. It's a 7-story hotel shaped like an elephant, which eventually, it was a bad idea. It became a brothel until even the hookers checked out, and then it burned to the ground. But Martin Couney had a brother who was already here named Alphonse, who was a wild child, and he was a jockey at the racetrack out there, and he changed the name Cone to Coney. And so our hero that first became Coney on his way to Couney. Meanwhile, in Paris, they really were experimenting with the incubator as a new device, but it was a really rudimentary thing. It was called a couveuse, meaning a mother hen. It was more like a double boiler or something. And it actually ran the risk of boiling the baby because the heat was so, the gas was so uneven at Paris maternity that they just stopped even using that. They just used hot water bottles. So this is going on. Peasants were trying to save their babies by wrapping them up in feathers or putting them near the hearth. It didn't usually work. Now, Cooney also mentioned, and he wasn't in Paris at this time, he was in New York, that there was a child hatchery in Berlin, and I thought for sure that was absolute BS. But I found it. There was a child hatchery in Berlin. It says Die Kinderbrütenstalt, which means child hatchery. And so it turned out there were these incubator exhibits in Europe. They were the work of a French engineer. They weren't the work of a doctor. And this engineer showed them in Berlin. He claimed the machines were so superior to anything else that you didn't really need any expertise to use them. It was almost like a magic oven. You just pop in the baby and voila. It wasn't true at all. He had very skilled nurses, but all the showmen wanted to get in on this right away because it attracted huge, huge crowds. People paid admission, and supposedly it required no expertise. So our friend, Mr. Coney, shows up he went to England to show them. And you can see it's Paul Altman's patent. And he later said he invented this. He didn't. It was somebody else who invented it. He had a show in England. And then he came back to the United States for that Omaha World's Fair, where he was now the eminent Dr. Martin Arthur Cooney, who has a wide experience in Europe. And he went on from there to the Buffalo World's Fair in 1901. Now, this World's Fair should have been an inflection point. There was a lot of interest in the medical community in this new machine. It was written up everywhere. Interestingly enough, one of the places besides Scientific American and Pediatrics and The Lancet and all these other places was Cosmo, which at that time was kind of a serious magazine, and that was a big deal that it was written up in Cosmo. The leading journalists of the day wrote for Cosmo. However, and it was here that some other important things happened. He met a nurse who would become his wife. She really knew what she was doing. And the nurses were a lot of the secret sauce behind why this whole system was working. But something awful was happening here, which was the beginning of American eugenics. So genetics was a very new science, but eugenics, the idea that we can manipulate the human gene pool and eliminate undesirables, was coming in. So somebody complaining about this exhibit anonymously in a medical journal that was reprinted said, you know, the question naturally presents itself as to whether this is worthwhile, whether the race as a whole does not suffer from the preservation of weaklings to perpetuate their kind. It was this kind of thinking, and there were in the medical literature, there were a lot of reasons for why neonatology was slow to catch on, having to do with lack of resources, but nobody ever mentioned that right parallel to this, you had this eugenics movement going on. And I kept looking at it and thinking, so this is going on. Meanwhile, most of the showmen, other than Cooney, have gotten out of this business because it isn't at all true that this is a toaster oven. It's a hell of a lot of work. And Bailey of Barnum and Bailey, who tried this for a while, was like, you know what, forget it. This World's Fair was famous for another calamity, which is the president was assassinated. Almost right next to here, William McKinley was assassinated at this World's Fair. So Martin Cooney went on from there, from this very popular show to Coney Island and Atlantic City. And meanwhile, hospitals were kind of trying incubators and giving up. They didn't have enough nurses to deal with them. Hospitals at that time were kind of dirty. You really avoided a hospital unless you were poor and desperate. It wasn't a place most people who had any means would give birth at home. There were a whole lot of reasons why they were resistant to this technology, and they weren't using it right, so it wasn't working. Meantime, Cooney is at Coney Island, and he's got a barker out there, hey, step inside, ladies and gentlemen, maybe the future president is inside. But really also it was this bizarre mashup of showmanship and medicine, because the nursing and the medical care was flawless. He's claiming that he's making propaganda for preemies, and he had these reunion shows where he would actually show his graduates going down the boardwalk in floats. You kind of hope that poor Stork was dead already. But when I interviewed some ethicists, one of the ethicists I interviewed at Columbia at the Mailman School of Public Health said to me, you know what, all public health is propaganda, which I think is also interesting when we're thinking about COVID, but he claimed he was making propaganda for preemies. So there you go. Hospitals are giving up. It's really a sideshow, and he's getting an 85% success rate. In his Chicago show that you see there, he met this doctor, Julius Hess, who was impeccable and a real doctor, and their friendship would be transformative. Hess was the first person to listen to him and believe him, but nobody wanted to listen to Hess either, so they're both struggling. Cooney is now in another sideshow at Coney Island at Dreamland. This is even more over the top than Luna Park. It's like Disney World on steroids, and it was had the shabbiest possible construction and every zoning violation. So this happened. It burned to the ground one night. And when that happened, the New York Times stopped the press and printed on the first page that all the babies had died. It wasn't true. They got all the babies out, but there was a lot of damage done by that. There were people who wanted to shut him down because this was not a fit place for babies to be. But there wasn't a choice between a great place for babies to be and a sideshow. There was a choice between a sideshow, and these babies were going to die because even New York's premier hospital, Sloan Maternity, they didn't have the resources. They couldn't deal with this. They were trying to deal with women dying in childbirth. They were trying to deal with overall infant mortality. And so their triage was that they kind of let the little ones go. Meanwhile, this same year, this American eugenics movement was gathering steam. There were Better Babies contests at state fairs, almost like hog and heifer contests, where they would judge things like the shape of the nose and eyes and ears to give out prizes for basically Aryan features. One of the organizers said she viewed the contests in hopes of speeding the day when we can have scientific elimination before birth of the unfit. By 1917, a real doctor in Chicago released a movie called The Black Stork based on his very popular argument that children with severe disabilities should be allowed to die and medical care withheld. The ad for this movie, The Black Stork, which played all over the country, said, kill defectives, save the nation. Involuntary sterilization of tens of thousands of African Americans, Mexican Americans, people with disabilities, people who've committed crimes. So preemies weren't ever directly targeted by this, but they're called weaklings. Treatment has been proven for decades, but all of the New York hospitals are now sending their patients to a sideshow. So literally in New York, Bellevue, Maimonides, Long Island Jewish, New York Hospital, in Atlantic City, the medical center. So Martin Cooney, these were really the years where he began faking his credentials more and more and more. And so I think he felt like to save his business, he had to lie even more about who he was. But he painted himself into a corner because if he went out of business, these babies were just going to die. Even as late in the 1930s, he was saying, I can't understand why people still believe these children aren't worth saving. So now this looks a little bit different. I'll speed it along so we can also have lots of time for conversation, but that's that World's Fair again. And this was actually a collaboration with Julius Hess. It's 1933, they still have nothing in the hospitals, almost. Hess has a little hospital with no funding. He needs a propaganda machine. Cooney needs respectability. And you see that arrow where it says Paris, I'll show you that in a minute. This is what it looks like inside. It looks like a little hospital. And this is what's outside, is the midway, the midgets, the infamous stripper, Sally Rand. And this is what's in the Hall of Science. It's eugenics. And it's talking about eliminating the degenerates. It's Nazi language. The Nazis were deeply inspired by American eugenicists. I found all kinds of documentation about, as a sidelight, conversations among them. These are the same eugenicists who would be very persuasive with the State Department in not allowing a flood of Jews into the country before the Holocaust. But in 1933, they were up to this, and they were all for improving the human race with this. This panel at the Chicago World's Fair has kind of been whitewashed out of the records. The only place I found it was in a journal that was published at the time. And I can talk about that as well. So again, it was me thinking like, so am I right? So am I the one who found out the truth about Cooney, who Cooney was, but also what was going on with this stuff right next door? Why is it taking so long to take preemies? Well, look what's going on here. And you've got a group of people who are literally called weaklings and feeble. However, Cooney did work his propaganda at this World's Fair. They had a radio show about saving preemies, and it was broadcast coast to coast on the radio. And after the World's Fair ended, Chicago became the first city in the nation with dedicated public health policy and funding for preemies. It would become the model for the whole nation. So propaganda for preemies indeed. This was to be Cooney's last hurrah. It was the New York World's Fair, and it was a bust for him financially. It was 1939. It was still the Depression, and the world was on the brink of war, and he lost his riches there, so it was a bad idea, unless you were one of 100 children whose lives he saved, because New York still had almost nothing for these children. When the fair ended, he offered his life-saving equipment to the city of New York, which turned it down. They didn't want it. So he had to go back to Coney Island, which is now decrepit. This is what it looks like. So now what are the ethics of this? He was actually kind of dismissed until very recently as kind of a weird little quirk rather than the rightful founder of American neonatology. Here he is with one of his babies toward the end of his life. Her name is Beth Allen, and she's alive and well and living in New Jersey. And so when I found this, what I saw was, first of all, I met many of the babies whose lives he saved. There were 6,500 to 7,000 of these children. And when you look at the line of influence, his friend Julius Hess was credited as the founder of American neonatology, but Hess himself actually credited Merton Cooney multiple times in multiple places. That was where he learned it. And one thing I was able to do with this book was he's now really kind of recognized. I was invited by 1,600 neonatologists to come to their convention. They've now really actually accepted that this crazy showman is the rightful father of American neonatology. He was the one who was the inspiration for it. And whatever phoniness he had, he is the guy who did it. And so I felt like I was able to bring this guy out of the shadows and give him the recognition that he deserved. That last slide is, she was not supposed to live a day, according to her doctor. She was born weighing less than 2 pounds, and she lived to be 96 years old. She's kind of at the end of her life. So that's my slideshow. I went through kind of quick to give us time. But I would be very happy to answer any questions you might have, and if I could get into how to.
Well, I know that, yeah, if you take the screen share off, I know that.
I know now I can't find it.
It should be, it's a little green strip, I think.
Here we go. New share. I think I'm back here.
Don't cut yourself off.
I think I may have. I don't know what I did.
You took the PowerPoint off.
Stop share. There I am. Okay, I'm back.
And Rachel, you made a point in the chat about what was going on at the same time at this. And I'm gonna, if you want to talk about that. Oh, I'm gonna unmute.
I mean, it's I think it's fascinating. I think the way you wrote the book is fascinating. I was just, you know, another side of the eugenics movement around that time in the 1910s, 1920s is all of they had just discovered vitamins. They had just discovered nutrition. Hess was a big guy in infant feeding and infant formula and what do you feed infants. And so Borden's, for example, had, they would do things where they would measure children in order to prove that everyone should get milk and drink a quart of milk a day. And so they would have promotions in schools where they would say, you know, measure your children, and, you know, to teachers, measure your children. And the standards that they used, I believe, came from the Carnegie Foundation, and they came from Scotland. So the standards that they were using to measure children in New York City as to whether their head was big enough and their body was big enough and their complexion was right and everything were based on Scottish children. So they clearly were not going to work. So they said that something like 25% of all New York City school children were malnourished, in part because the standards were just totally wrong. So so this whole thing is just fascinating. And
now the Carnegie Foundation also was one of the biggest supporters of American eugenics.
There you go.
Wow.
There you go.
Yeah, they don't like to advertise that.
No, not anymore.
But you could see, and was at Cold Spring Harbor, there was a whole Bureau of Eugenics. And my father actually did have, as a child, a report card from one of these. It was, you know, almost every state fair in the country had these things. They were called Better Baby Contests, and they would measure you for certain metrics. And, you know, they were kind of Aryan metrics that they were looking at.
Totally.
Nancy has a comment about her dad being in an incubator, right, Nancy?
Well, my father was born to a very poor family. My grandfather was a mechanic. And so and it was 1929. So it was, you know, about the time when, and they put him in the gas stove.
Yep, they did that. That was the best home treatment, was that they put the baby near the stove, and hopefully it worked. Now the babies that Cooney was treating were 2-pounders. They were really small. So sometimes, like, the hospitals could help if the baby was like 4 pounds or something like that. But it was this kind of triage where, you know, we don't have enough. And Beth was the baby in one of those last pictures, said, even when she was born, by then it was the early 40s, and they said, oh, the hospital has an incubator, but we have a baby in it already, you know.
Wow.
Well, he lived till he was 83, so things worked out okay.
Worked out, yeah.
And so you said most of them are 2 pounds. So what period of gestation generally could he save?
You know what? They didn't know, because they really didn't have a way of measuring. Like, a lot of them, it seemed like they were, you know, maybe 8 weeks or something, but they didn't really have a way of measuring gestation for sure. They were going by weight, and some of them may have been full term, but also underweight.
Right. So maybe as much as 8 weeks early, which would be 32 weeks, and now what we do 25 weeks or something like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, we can go much younger. I mean, you have to realize they had almost nothing then. You know, they didn't have IVs. They didn't really have medicine. They didn't have electronic monitors. This was all done by hand. And for him, it was really with a secret sauce in this was his nurses were phenomenal.
Wow. And does he? I can't remember. I read the book, and I can't remember if you talk about his survival rate or anything like that.
Yeah. So from the beginning, he was claiming 85% with no documentation. But as time went by, there were people documenting it. One of the criticisms of him among people who thought he was a real doctor was like, well, if you care so much, then why aren't you publishing clinical results? And it was because he was a fake doctor. So for me, I also felt like I actually would have judged him more harshly if the credentials were real. There were people who felt like, well, how very self-serving, you're making money on the midway. And I would have maybe thought that too, like, okay, why didn't you try to fight harder within why didn't you do what Julius Hess did and try to work within the system rather than doing this crazy thing? He didn't have a choice, and he couldn't publish in peer-reviewed journals, and he really didn't even have an inkling of how to publish those kind of results. But Julius Hess was keeping track in Chicago, and they were, I have the figures in the book, they were close to that 85% by New York. They were measuring, the doctor who was doing this was trained at Mayo and said he was seeing a 90% survival rate in babies who should have had a 90% mortality rate, like what you'd expect. So it was a lot.
Wow. So did you end up feeling, I mean, like, you were more sympathetic toward him maybe than what you expected at the beginning, or how did that?
I ended up really being very admiring of him. I kind of felt like I was living with a ghost in the house. And sometimes I think, well, what do you think of me? Because I'm blowing his cover. But that's a hard one, because I have a friend who wrote a biography, and she said, by the end of it, she ended up hating this woman. Like she really, you don't know exactly what you're going to uncover. But for me, what really did it was that it took me a long time to try to find his patients, because of course there were no records. And every single one of them, these were, women in their 70s to 90s. I only found men after the book came out. Most of the people still alive are women. But there was nobody who felt like, oh, I was exploited, or how awful this man was not every single person just felt like, I am so grateful this man saved my life. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have my children and my grandchildren. I don't care what what kind of fakery he was doing, or whether I was in a show. And a lot of the women also thought it was kind of cool. Like they actually thought it was something that marked them as special. I've seen a couple of obituaries where it's actually started off by saying, so-and-so began life in Martin Cooney's sideshow.
And do you think he was just a big-hearted guy, or, he got into it because he saw a chance for money?
Yeah.
And he kept at it because he had a big heart, and he became attached to this mission.
That's kind of what I thought. I get asked again and again, what was he thinking? And this was something interesting also with my book editor, because by my magazine training is like, you cannot say anything if you can't prove it twice. And I guess kept being told, like, you can't, they were kind of amused by how obsessive I was. But I felt like, I don't know what he was thinking. I can only say he might well have thought this, or he had every reason to think this. But I felt like from what he did and said, I think he really did care a lot. I think if you take care of babies, you care about them. And his wife was a nurse, and the other head nurse lived with them. The things.
Did you ever find any of his writings, or his anything that was in his voice? I've heard someone say it's very hard to write a biography if you don't know the person's voice. Were you able to find his voice as opposed to other people's?
There was not much that he left, but I did find that there was some of his transcripts of his conversations with concessions committees. And there were also some letters he sent to parents, and there were some letters that he sent to the concession committee. And he was a character. He was, he was feisty. He was fighting around with them, especially like the New York concessions committee as well. I think he did care, but he was very strong-willed. He got into like a pissing match with, somebody over whether they wanted him at the New York World's Fair to install an electric dishwasher for the bottles. This was the new thing, the dishwasher. And he was just like, how dare you tell me how to run a nursery? Just as a matter of principle, I'm not having a dishwasher. We're not doing it. And it was in the newspapers like, incubator guy tells the concession committee to lay an egg. It just, but he would fight about that stuff.
Maureen has a good question. Maureen, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask it.
Yeah, Dawn, do you know how many or all the babies found their way to him or the Midway, these incubators? Was it mostly through hospitals or the parents themselves seeking them out?
Yeah, so it was both. It was a lot from hospitals as time went on. It was also parents who were just desperate. I opened the book with a story of just, the baby was born in a hospital and the parents were told there's just absolutely no hope. This child can't live a day. That was the woman who was 96 years old. And they were like, well, wait a minute. I think there's a sideshow that, they would actually just take that baby was taken
Wow.
in a taxi to Coney Island, wrapped up in a towel, 2-pound baby, get in a taxi and go. This is a crazy, like when I called it the strange case, it wasn't just he who was strange, but our whole culture in this.
Yeah.
And some of them were also foundlings that were brought from foundling hospitals.
It's amazing.
Abby, what about you? Do you have a question or comment?
No, I regret learning about the book only, a day ago or whenever this event was announced. So now I'm desperate to read it. I have so many questions, but
Thank you. Well, I'm easy to find too, and you can always ask me questions afterwards. My parents gave me a very good name for the age of Google. So if you Google me,
Yeah.
you'll find me.
Yeah.
And so, but what about, Dawn, the response to the book and the impact you felt like the book had?
I felt like it was nice because, first of all, the patients of Couney's who I met, who came forward, one of the things they wanted to know was, have you ever met another one? They were all like, is there anybody else out there? And so at one point I had a reunion for them, actually, and that's in the book, but I met more afterwards. I went to Chicago and these people in the audience were like, oh, I was in that incubator. That's, what I had them come up on stage. But for me, it's also been just, there is a doctor who I worked with the book who also strongly believed that Couney was the rightful father of American neonatology, but he's just getting more recognition and more. I was sort of afraid to go on a limb with that thing about how the eugenics was really influencing it, but the reception in the medical community has now been like, yes, you're right. That I think also enough time has passed now. It's the 21st century. It's not threatening to criticize things that happened long before any of the people, who are institutionally powerful could have been responsible for it.
It's like the Sparta babies or something, just if they can't, if they're not going to survive, or let's just put them out.
But you have it now on the other end. It's like, well, we don't have enough ventilators. Who gets one?
Right. And or I'm in Texas, and the idea in Texas that the lieutenant governor, we're grandparents, will die for the state of the economy, to keep the economy going, crazy stuff like that. Kim, I know you must have questions.
Well, I mean, I read this. I loved this book, and I've been to
thank you.
other of Dawn's. I went to one of your other readings and speaking events, and I loved where it was held. It was at the Coney Island Baby Bar.
That was so much fun. Yeah.
It's no longer there, but I mean, under that name.
Oh, it's gone.
Yeah. But I love this book. I think a lot of it was because I love the Coney Island area, and it was just. It's such, to be real and factual, it's so fantastical. It's like you're reading like The Wizard of Oz or something, you know what I mean? Like, and it just keeps getting more and more fantastical what this guy has done. And then you think, God, he saved babies. I mean, it's an amazing story. I'm just really glad. And I love that you put yourself in it. And did you find at a certain point, like, was that an uncomfortable thing to write yourself into it? Like, yes. How did you go about doing that?
It was, I really resisted it. And I had somebody saying, oh, you should put yourself in it. And I kept saying, no, it's not that kind of book. And I don't want to do it that way. It was hard to structure. It's not in chronological order strictly. It's kind of braided, and I have my detractors for that. But I I also felt like chronological, some of it started to feel like then there was this exposition and then that exposition and then another exposition, kind of samey. And I also felt like the story of how his fabrications were uncovered was kind of interesting. And that story began long before I started working on it. There were some doctors trying to figure out who was this guy. And I wanted to sort of include him, and then I couldn't really tell the story of how his fabrications were uncovered without including myself in it. And I just, like I say, I resisted it. It did feel a little strange to do that. But I also, there's such a lot of work in uncovering this kind of story, and it's never the work of one person.
Well, you never got any pushback from anybody about your how you basically sort of uncovered the truth about this guy, right? I mean,
you know, the one thing I got, it was a nasty review in a newspaper by another, and it was an academic, but he was a professor. He wasn't in medicine at all. And I actually think he felt like doing a takedown because my bio said something like, I'm a short story writer and a memoirist. And I think he kind of had a, how dare you? And he came out, it was a review, and he said, oh, you know, she never gives any documentation or proof of how of what percentage of babies were saved, which is untrue. It was in the book. And she doesn't really make a case for eugenics. It was this kind of tear down. And this is the only time I've done this. This is my 5th book. And I know you are never, ever, ever, ever supposed to argue with a reviewer, because it just, you know, no matter what it happens, it looks like you're petty and you're sour grapes. I was so pissed off. I wrote to my editor and I said, save me from myself if this is the wrong thing. But I responded to this and I said, you know, I normally would never respond to a review, but there are this, and this factual errors, down to the fact that he misquoted from the book. Like he came up with a sentence that was a mashup. And I sent it to the book review editor. And he actually wrote back to me and apologized. And the review had apparently only appeared online. It wasn't actually in the paper because they were cutting back so much. And it just kind of shrank down. So it still wasn't a good review, but some of that stuff that was just factually incorrect was taken out of it.
well,
And
good.
it wasn't like the New York Times or anything.
No, it wasn't the New York Times. The New York Times did what is it, brief? It's not briefly, not new and noteworthy.
Notable,
Sure.
new and notable. Yeah, and you got reviewed by you got a mention in the New Yorker and
I did get the New Yorker. I wasn't expecting that at all. That was just like, wow.
I know, that's great. So anybody else? I have a couple of other questions, but I don't want to like warn anybody. Raise your hand if you have another question or something. I think
I would just say it's not really, it's not a question, just a sort of an observation that occurred to me. So I have triplet nephews who were born, as multiples tend to be, very early at the NICU at the Georgetown NICU, which from what I understand is sort of the preeminent NICU in the area, in the DC area. And I also have friends who had one of their babies sort of spend a lot of time there. And for a while I was going back, I then spent a ton of time in that NICU because of my nephews. And for a number of years after my nephews were born, I would go with my brother and sister-in-law and their kids, and with my friends and their kids, to these Georgetown NICU reunions. Oh. And I realized that the head of the NICU there, I forget his name now, I can't believe it, but he would sort of make like graduates of the NICU, you know, who are 20 and 25 years old, come up and say like, can you believe so-and-so was born at, you know, 1.8 pounds, or and now he's a linebacker for blah, blah, blah. And there was an element to that reminded me to a little bit of what you were talking about with like the parade, the
He
parade.
started that. That was his thing, was the reunions and the babies. And can you believe,
Yeah.
2-pound baby?
And there
Yeah.
was something, I have to say, it felt less, I mean, it's a little schmaltzy, but it's so delightful too. It feels less sideshowy and more just kind of triumphant, like, can you believe these people survived and thrived? And so I really I liked that element of the when we used to go to the NICU reunions at Georgetown, and I just realized your one of your slides reminded me very much of that.
Yeah, and it's people said to me, "Oh, why was everybody so fascinated with this sideshow?" And I feel like, well, if you're in a hospital and you walk past the maternity ward, it's fascinating, even if they're not preemies. It's like you can't upstage a baby. And especially in this, people just honestly could not believe that a baby that small could survive. So he'd have people who would insist, "Oh, those can't be real babies. They must be wax, or they must be, something else."
And yes, and because they can be so tiny. I mean, it's just amazing. And I think it's a great thing that they bring linebackers back or in their 20s, because it gives parents hope who have kids, and also this idea of don't give up on them. So I think that's good. So what's your next project? Are you writing something else, or?
I was researching something at the New York Public Library when everything on earth shut down, and then I've been just, I don't know, sitting in Coronaville writing.
Coronaville. Gosh, well, anybody else? We're out of time, but if I don't want to end it if people have other things they want to talk about.
You can reach me anytime also if other questions arise, because I'd love to hear more about the research that you're doing. And
I'd love to talk about Seagate with you and
I did some
Coney
research
Island
on
there.
Seagate. There's a
the
guy
woman that I've been go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, there's a guy who's kind of like the Seagate historian. I don't know what I did with his stuff, but I
talked my way in there as well, because the woman I was researching used to run Brooklyn Borough Gas Company and live in Seagate, and in the 1920s. So anyway, I will reach out to you.
I'd love to know
I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, and there's also other resources in Coney Island. If you I'll give you what I got.
Yeah.
And Rachel, what can you tell us about what you're working on?
Well, I'm working on a biography of Rose Knox, Fran Knox Gelatin. And I've also been looking at women who ran companies in the early 1900s. And this woman, Mary Dillon, ran Brooklyn Borough Gas Company from 1924 to 1948. And it was one of the top 25 utility companies in the United States. And she lived in Seagate, and the gas company headquarters was right overlooking Coney Island. And so anyway, it's a fascinating time, and the way that they treated women then is a fascinating time, and the way that women presented themselves, which is what I'm looking at, as a fascinating thing. So
wow. Well, I think we've got people who have a lot going on. I mean, how interesting that what you both are up to, and Maureen and Abby, you probably have some things going on. I know Kim's has a book always in the works, but that I try to get her to finish.
I know. I've got to get back to that.
But anyway, and I welcome it, especially if you haven't been on a NextTribe event before. We have all kinds of great virtual events. We're trying, we do the articles, but because of our shutdown, we thought, well, let's go virtual and let's expand this. So please, I can email you guys separately about some of our other events that we're doing. And
please.
And Rachel, I know you're such a good one keeping up with us. Thank you.
Oh, hey, I love what you're doing, Jeannie. It makes a lot of sense.
Okay, well, thank you. That means a lot. So, and Dawn, thank you so much. And Dawn also does our yoga nidra on Wednesday evenings.
Oh, good.
Express de-stress is how, which is basically shavasana the whole time, which is like, how great is that? And then Kim does yoga on Monday afternoons and Friday evenings, virtual yoga. So, so we try to just have a bunch of things that are interesting and also keep us sane. I think that's the main thing, is trying to stay sane. So. But anyway, so thank everybody for coming. It was great seeing you. And
Thank you all.
Dawn.
Thank you.
You too.
Dawn, it
Thank you,
was just a
Dawn,
wonderful
so
book. Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful book. Thanks.
Very much.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.